Welcome to our Death Rituals series, a series dedicated to exploring how cultures around the world honor death, grief, and remembrance. From the vibrant altars of Dia de los Muertos to the quiet precision of traditional embalming, from indigenous mourning ceremonies to the inked memorials of modern tattooists. Each episode uncovers how humans give meaning to loss through ritual, through intimate conversations with those who tend to death, museum curators, artists, cultural leaders, and funeral professionals. We look at how ceremony, creativity, and community transform grief into connection. It's about the universal ways we celebrate, remember, and carry forward the lives of those who came before us. Revealing how we face death says everything about how we choose to live. Gail Rubin is an American author, speaker, and certified thanatologist, known for helping people have more open, less intimidating conversations about death and end-of-life planning. Often called the Doyenne of Death, she uses humor, films, and practical tools to make a traditionally taboo topic more approachable. She's the author of books including A Good Goodbye and Kicking the Bucket List, which guide people through funeral planning and getting their affairs in order. Based in Albuquerque, she's also a leading voice behind the Death Café movement in the U.S., encouraging honest discussions about mortality. Enjoy.
Gail Rubin, thank you so much for joining me. I've been telling a lot of people about our conversation. I'm very excited to talk with you. I think people are going to learn a lot from this conversation. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Looking forward to our conversation.
Amazing. Well, I always like to start hearing where you grew up and what kind of kid you were.
Well, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in suburban Maryland, and I grew up right next to some woods. And I loved playing in the woods. I was artistic and creative. And when it came to my Judaism, I mean, as a kid, maybe not so much, but as I grew into a teenager, I was very earnest in my beliefs.
So what did that look like? I know, and we'll get into everything that you're doing today, but what did that look like as a child?
Oh, well, my parents raised us in a conservative Jewish synagogue, and I went to Sunday school and Hebrew school, and I was bat mitzvahed and confirmed. So, yeah, I took it very seriously.
And did you do Shabbat and Havdalah and sort of the weekly rituals?
Well, we always did Shabbat, and we usually went to Friday night services. We didn't strictly keep kosher, but at Passover, we did have a separate set of dishes to use during Passover, but we didn't have two sets of dishes for milk versus meat.
I actually grew up in a kosher home and with two sets of dishes and silverware and serving and cooking utensils. And I remember my stepdad, when we were young, if we used the wrong fork, he would stick it in dirt. As time has gone by, he's become a bit more relaxed. So it used to be you could not have a milk dessert, and now it's like, well, if you wait 20 minutes,
it's okay.
So I feel like religion, Judaism, whether you're religious or not, it's about finding what works for you. And I know there are definitely people who, they need to abide by all of the rules, and that's great for them. And that doesn't work for everybody. So finding what does work, I think, is extremely helpful and meaningful.
Yes. And sometimes it's a combination, but always the kavanah, the intention behind it.
I love that. Yes. Yeah. So let's jump in. You are a death educator. You are a member of the Hevra Kadisha, which is the Holy Society in Judaism. We're going to go deep into that. You are an author and a speaker. Tell us a little bit about your own personal grief journey, which you speak very publicly about, and how that intersects with the work that you're doing today. But I also know that your work as a death educator predates a lot of your personal grief journey.
Yes, I became the Doyenne of Death in 2010 when my first book, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die, came out. And I use humor and films and film clips and outside the box activities to get people to talk about death because a lot of people don't. I was one of the first people to hold a Death Café in the United States in September of 2012. And that's an opportunity for people to come together and have a little coffee or tea, some cake or cookies, and talk about what's ever on your mind about mortality issues. And I also was one of the first people to hold a Before I Die festival on a regular basis starting back in 2017. I've held 8 of them, but this year I'm taking off because I'm coming out with a new book called 98.6 Mortality Movies to See Before You Die. And this will be my 5th book in the end-of-life field. And it'll be a discussion guide about how you can watch movies and then talk about end-of-life issues more easily than just saying, so, if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, what would you want us to do?
Right. So you started way back in 2010, and tell us a little bit about how you got into that and then how time and events in your own life have shaped or shifted your work.
So in 2000, I got married to David Bleischer, and we had a very creative Jewish Western wedding. And everybody had such a good time. I wanted to write a book about creative life cycle events and call it Matchings, Hatchings, and Dispatchings. Well, about weddings and births and deaths. I got to do a monthly feature in our local newspaper about those topics. And it was the stories about death and funerals that got the most reader response. And I figured, there's already plenty of books on creative wedding planning. We don't need more on that topic. But there wasn't much about creative funeral planning. So I focused on funerals. And my first book, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die, came out. And that put me on the path of being a pioneering death educator. And in 2023, Dave and I had been married for over 22 years, and he went for a surgery, supposed to be a low-risk surgery, but in fact, medical complications set in. He had a heart attack, sepsis, kidney failure. He was hospitalized, and he coded in the hospital. His heart stopped. He was revived. He was in the intensive care unit for a week, and after about a week, he was not, he got a little better, and then he crashed, and they said it's time for hospice. So he was put on inpatient hospice, and I was with him around the clock for a week, and I left the room to make a phone call, and within 15 minutes, he died. He didn't want me to see him die. So that was in April of 2023, followed by 4 months later, my dad, who said he had a heart attack, and while waiting for the EMTs to arrive, he said, I want what Dave had, which he meant inpatient hospice, which is very much a blessing. And then my in-laws, Dave's mom and her second husband, they wanted medical aid in dying. They died in July of 2024. And then my mom died in October 31st of all days, that year as well. And then other deaths, and my cat. So I had 8 deaths in 24 months in my family. And by the time my brother-in-law, Dave's brother Stephen, died unexpectedly, that's when it really started to hit me. I just kept going and going and going. I'm a death educator. I know about grief. I can deal with this. Well, with Stephen's unexpected death, suddenly I was like, I think I need help. And I did start going to a grief therapist, and that was very helpful. And then I found out about psychedelic-assisted therapy that a friend of mine in Santa Fe actually conducted those kind of guided trips to help with emotional healing. And so I did that on the 2nd anniversary of Dave's death, and it was life-changing. It absolutely got me out of the valley of the shadow of death. It was actually related to the Hevra Kadisha Tahara ceremony that we do to purify a body before burial.
Okay, so let's do this. Tell our listeners what Hevra Kadisha is, what the Tahara is, sort of the elements, and then let's go back to your healing journey.
You bet. So the Hevra Kadisha, it means holy society. Some people think it means secret society because these are volunteers who do the Jewish ritual of the Tahara, which is washing and dressing the body for burial. And it's not only washing, it's purifying. It's a two-part process where the body, and women do it for women, men do it for men. So there's a physical washing and then a ritual washing where water is poured the length of the body as we chant in Hebrew, Elohai Nashanahi, which means, God, the soul you have given me is a pure one. And then once it's like a mikvah, the ritual bath, but since most places don't have a ritual bath for a dead person, we pour the water over the body on a table that has a drain in it, usually in the funeral home. So that's the Tahara ceremony.
And how long is the Tahara?
Usually takes about an hour. We have specific prayers that we say, and between the physical cleaning, the ritual purification, and then dressing the body and putting the body in the casket, it takes about an hour.
Okay, so that's the Tahara. And how many people are present for the Tahara?
Usually we try to get a team of 5 or 6 people. And in the case of this Tahara that I did literally the day before I went to Santa Fe to do my psychedelic-assisted therapy session, the woman's daughter was actually in the room with us. And she had brought a prayer shawl, which is not common among women, but the tradition is when you are burying a person with their prayer shawl, you clip one of the fringes off to render it moot, because this prayer shawl is there to remind you to do all of the 613 mitzvot in the Torah. But when you're dead, you can't do anything, let alone do mitzvahs. So, and being a member of the Hevra Kadisha is a great mitzvah because you are doing something for that person who cannot return the favor.
Yeah, I read that the whole objective of the Hevra Kadisha, or its main purpose, is to prepare somebody's body for death with dignity, equality, and deep reverence, and that it is, like you're saying, the truest act of kindness because it's done for somebody who cannot repay you. So I want to talk a bit more about the other aspects of the Hevra Kadisha and what you get out of it. How does one become a member of the Hevra Kadisha?
Well, it takes a little searching. If you're already involved in a synagogue, chances are the rabbi could let you know if there's a local Hevra Kadisha that you could join. When I joined, it was right after I had written A Good Goodbye, and I wanted to be more involved in the local death ritual support of that. Our Jewish Federation, I believe, the organization was under the wing of that. So you might check with a JCC or a Jewish Federation or any of your local Jewish organizations to find out if you have a Hevra Kadisha there. There's also a national organization called Kavod, which is dedicated to fostering the use of end-of-life Jewish traditions. Think about it. Even though I had a really good Jewish education, I don't remember learning anything about death and funerals. It wasn't until my great-aunt Mary died and I found myself face-to-face with her casket and thinking I could peek inside and take a look at her. And I did this with my youngest brother. And what we saw was her tiny body in what looked like a linen body bag. And we had no idea what we were looking at. So part of what I'm hoping to do is to foster more education about our Jewish funeral traditions And so it's not so scary or misunderstood.
Well, like you, I grew up in a pretty religious home, and I don't remember hearing about the Hevra Kadisha ever at all. And I'm sure my stepdad will listen to this and he will tell me he did talk about it, but I just don't remember. And like many things, I think you have to hear things over and over for them to sort of sink in. So you gave us some great resources if you're interested in looking for a Hevra Kadisha near you, but can you tell us what it looks like to be trained and how long that takes and sort of to become a member and also what that commitment looks like?
Well, we had like maybe a couple hour training where we have a script and they go over the script with you. And they will do a demonstration tahara. Somebody volunteers to be the body. And we did need to be inoculated against hepatitis B.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And we're taught about personal protective equipment, PPE, the gloves, as well as masks and aprons. So, and the taught about the dangers of bloodborne pathogens, things like that. But generally, and when we had the pandemic, people were like terrified of, what happens. But in fact, because it was more of an airborne, people who aren't breathing aren't going to give you COVID.
Right.
So we had that training session, and that is available on YouTube if you want to look that up to see 2 films from Mexico that illustrate very traditional Ashkenazi Jewish traditions. And you may ask, why Mexico? Well, Mexico was one of the few countries in the world to allow Jews to emigrate in the 1930s to get away from Nazi Germany. So there are some very traditional Ashkenazi communities in Mexico and Mexico City. And these 2 films, My Mexican Shiva and Nora's Will, are both comedies. They have comedic elements to them, but they also show very traditional Jewish traditions, not only the Tahara, but for Shemira, Shomer, somebody who sits and prays to keep the body company before burial, burying quickly, issues of scheduling, setting up the house for sitting Shiva, which is a whole other aspect to discuss, but a very wonderful tradition in the Jewish tradition to force you to sit with your grief and to process it in that week immediately after the person's death. So Judaism really has a lot of wonderful traditions that support our psychological healing after a death.
Well, we'll put links in the show notes to your talk and the titles of those movies. I agree, I think generally speaking, organized religion is very good at great joy and great sorrow because it prescribes steps to take, and those steps are based on a long history of people living and suffering and also experiencing joy in birth and weddings and other things. So I do agree with that. And I think we can all learn, whether it's our religion or not, we can learn from these rituals that date back in history. My understanding is that the Hevra Kadisha dates back to Talmudic times, and that by the Middle Ages, there were formal Hevra Kadisha societies in nearly every Jewish community. Apparently, the most famous early one was in Prague in 1564, and those practices shaped the practices that we experience today.
And, a lot of these traditions are both practically based and biblically based, like the idea of quick burial within 24 hours. If you're in a hot desert culture and somebody dies, there's no refrigeration in biblical times, and decomposition sets in within 24 hours. And modern health codes in the United States require that within 24 hours, a body either be refrigerated, buried, cremated, or embalmed, because of that decomposition setting in within 24 hours. But also in Deuteronomy, we have two passages, 21 and 23, that are actually referring to an executed criminal, but it says, his body shall not remain out all day. Thou shalt bury him the same day. He shall not remain overnight. So that gives us the biblical guidance for the quick burial. And if you're Orthodox, you're going to follow that 24-hour rule. But more liberal Reform Jews, we could use refrigeration to allow time for family to gather from far-flung places.
To be there, yeah.
And to be there.
So tell us about the Shemira, or the sitting with the body, and what is done and what it does for the person who's died and what it does for you as a member of the Hevra Kadisha.
So a shomer is one who watches. That's what it means. And on a practical level, in ancient desert times, you needed somebody to watch the body to make sure wild animals didn't tear it apart in the middle of the night. But spiritually speaking, they are there to recite psalms, keep the body and the spirit of the person that may be hovering around, keep them company, and also as a comfort for the family of the deceased, knowing that someone is always with that person, their body, the shell that held the human spirit. I actually had my own experience as a shomer. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there isn't much call for shomers in this neck of the woods. But a number of years ago, there was a young woman who went to visit her grandmother in Florida and tragically died of food poisoning while she was there. And the Chabad in Florida paid for her to be returned to New Mexico for burial, provided all the rules were followed, meaning having a shomer. And so I met the casket at the cargo area of the Albuquerque airport and followed the van to the funeral home. And this was at night. And we had set it up so that members of the Hevra Kadisha would take like 2-hour shifts overnight. And so I was the first one, 9 o'clock at night, in a empty funeral home. But it was fine. And it did feel holy to be doing that. It was a rather unique experience. And just reading the Psalms, I mean, how often do we recite Psalms? We know the 23rd and maybe the 121, but there are a lot of Psalms. And if you start going through the lesser known ones, it was comforting for me as the shomer and hopefully for that young lady spirit.
So are you reciting the Psalms out loud or in your mind, or is there a rule about that?
I think you can do it either way. Yeah, I think I did both.
Over 2 hours, I would imagine.
Yeah.
It would be hard to continue the whole time. Are there other elements of the Hevra Kadisha other than the Tahara and the Shemira, or are those the two predominant elements?
Well, it's interesting. There is, in my Mexican Shiva, a character they call the Hevra man, who is the guy who makes sure the family follows all the rules. But as part of it, he's trying to sell them stuff like, prepared foods and whatnot, which is part of the comedy in that. But I don't think we have anything like that in the United States. And probably one would turn to one's rabbi if you attend a synagogue, but so many Jews are unaffiliated. I don't know where they would get that guidance unless they go to like some websites with Jewish learning opportunities and they can look that up.
So tell us, I want to go back to the experience that you had with your psychedelic-assisted therapy, but before we get to that and sort of the, I don't know what to call it because it's not resolution of grief. It's more like, I don't know how you would describe it, if it was like letting go of the grief or letting in the grief. But whatever that experience was, and I would love for you to describe that in detail with respect to specifically your husband.
Every time I get to do a Tahara, I am reminded of how great it is to be alive. You know, we do not get much of an opportunity to directly confront dead bodies in our modern society. So being able to do that, we talk to the person, we apologize for any awkwardness while we're washing them and dressing them. It really does help you appreciate life and living life to the fullest every day, because you never know when it's not going to be your next day.
Right.
No.
Right. And how often do you participate in a Tahara?
You know, it depends how many deaths we have. And our Hevra Kadisha works on a volunteer by email system. We have a coordinator and the list of all of our members. The men, there's a group of men who get the male emails, and the women get emails for women who have died. And if I can do it, I will do it. It's usually at 8 o'clock in the morning. And some days, you know, I've already got something and I can't make it at 8 o'clock in the morning. But, you know, maybe one every other month.
Okay. Yeah. And then has it been, I have to imagine that the experience has changed over time. The first time has to be quite impactful just because, as you say, in our modern society, we really, unless you're in a profession that in healthcare or in law enforcement, you probably have never seen a dead body. So that has to be something, a lot to process. Has that part gotten easier or less jarring, or is it always as jarring, and is that what is the constant reminder to live each day?
So I've been doing this for 15 years now. That's hard to believe. But yeah, the first one was a little jarring, but I have gotten more used to it. But at the end of every Tahara, we do what we call the Hevra huddle, where we put our arms around each other in a tight circle and we look each other in the eye and we say thank you and it's a good day to be alive.
Yeah. And that has to give you also like a beautiful sense of community, aside from the reminder to live each day. Is being a member of the Hevra Kadisha something that people can choose to keep private, or is like, how can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there is a rule that you don't let any family member know that you personally help prepare their loved one's body. That has led, I think, to a lot of the idea that there's secrecy around being in the Hevra Kadisha. It's not. It's just that you don't want to let somebody know, yeah, I washed and dressed your person's dead body.
Right.
So I think that works against the idea of getting involved with the Hevra Kadisha, because we're not talking about specific burials that we have prepared the body for.
Yeah. Okay. And you talked about during the Tahara and the Shomer, there's a recitation of prayers and psalms. Otherwise, are you in silence?
During the Tahara, right, we're not supposed to be chattering to each other. It should be done as silently as possible, but we do have specific readings that we do throughout the course of the process. The readings that we do when we're pouring the water over the length of the body at the end of the physical cleaning, there's one for a man and one for a woman. They're both from the Song of Songs, and they are celebrations of the human body and just how beautiful this man is, this woman is in the prime of their lives. And in many cases, these are elderly people who have died of old age. So to hear those words from the Song of Songs celebrating the human form, it sometimes brings me to tears.
Well, now why don't you take us back to the experience that you had with the psychedelic healing journey the day after you had done a Tahara?
Yes. So after the seventh human death in my family, the last two being very unexpected, that was when the grief finally just overwhelmed me. And I decided to do this psychedelic-assisted therapy with a friend of mine up in Santa Fe. His name's Doug. And I had two goals with this therapy session. One was to get out from under this cloud of grief, but the second was also to release anger at one of those people who had died, who was a narcissist and treated me very badly. So the morning session, we dealt with anger issues, and that worked very well. And then after I was done with the anger management part of the program, I was like, man, I'm tired. I just want to lay down. So we go into the studio where we're doing this, and I'm laying on this very comfortable bed. And at this point, Doug says, at this point, you have the option to take a second dose. The medicine was MDMA, also called ecstasy. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'm all in. So he put a eye covering over my eyes and started with drumming, a Native American drum, and I could feel the vibrations through my body from my toes up to my head and back down. And Doug was feeding me strawberries. They tasted wonderful. I like to joke. So this is the second anniversary of my husband's death. So, it's been a while. It was like, it felt wonderful to have a handsome man feeding me strawberries. And at one point, he leaned over and he said, now, this strawberry is a perfect strawberry. This strawberry is a sacrament of the divine. So I ate it, and then things got very interesting. I started seeing my eyes were covered, but I was seeing in my mind's eye a dark background and the rainbow colors of the chakra energy centers. If you know about that in yoga, there's a rainbow from red all the way through the spectrum to violet and white at the top of these energy centers. So I could see those swirling colors. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. I had brought a big chunk of amethyst, and he slipped that into my hand and placed it over my heart. And then I started breathing deeper. And out of nowhere, or out of the divine, I don't know, I started saying Elohai Neshama Shenatata Tahorahi. That phrase that we say as we're pouring the water to do the purification of a body in a Tahara. God, the soul you have given me is a pure one. I said it at least 3 times, if not more. And after that, in my field of vision, the darkness changed to a white, waving, woven cloth with light behind it. And I felt like my soul is pure. I got out of the valley of the shadow of death, and I felt wonderful. I felt like that grief had been released, and it has stuck. I was freed from that dark cloud of grief that I had been walking under and insisting, no, I'm okay, but I wasn't really. I was just getting along. And after that experience, it was a peak experience, and I could not move for quite a while after that, but then I got my strength back, and Doug helped me up, and I told him what I had experienced, and he said that was probably like one of the top 3 experiences he had the honor of facilitating. So
you gave yourself a Tahara.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your grief if you don't mind. I think just like we don't talk about death, I don't think we really talk about grief enough either. And my own personal experience, having lost my father to a rare cancer over 11 years ago, is that grief is a very personal journey. And my journey is quite often going to be different from your journey. And there's not like a right or wrong way to go through it, as long as you're going through it. And maybe you weren't actually going through it. Maybe you were shutting yourself off from grief because you somehow, like, your body or your mind or your spirit knew it was just too overwhelming with all of these deaths. And maybe you needed to go through this experience to sort of break that logjam, so to speak. My experience has been constant but more gradual, if that makes sense. So I feel like in a way, I was grieving my father before he died. He was sick for 14 years and he had a terminal illness. But still, and he also died in inpatient or in the hospital hospice following a failed bone marrow transplant. And it was still such a shock when he died, even though I knew he was going to die. And I really needed to be alone. And my husband was wonderful. Our kids were younger, and he just let me be alone and listen to songs my dad wrote, music, and thankfully recorded his songs. So I listened to those and looked over letters and emails. And we used to make mixed tapes, which a lot of people won't know what those are, for each other.
Yeah.
And so I would listen to the music that we listened to together. And now it depends. Like, I'll hear a song and he'll come to me. I'll smell something and he'll come to me, or read something or look at a photograph. It's not as constant, but it's always there, if that makes sense. But I think for you, maybe it was just so overwhelming that you kind of had to shut it down for some time. And I think it's important for people to hear that, because you've spent so much of your life in death education, and you still struggled. And I think people need to know that, like, none of us are exempt. First of all, one of the things you say often in your talks, which I found funny but also so true, is that the death rate is holding steady at 100%. The mortality rate is holding steady at 100%. None of us are exempt. We will all die, and our loved ones will also die. And the more that we can talk about it, prepare for it, and also hear other people's stories and journeys, to know there's not one right way, but you will find your way, and you must find it. You must look for it if it's not coming to you, I think is extremely helpful. So I don't know what you're, open to sharing about your grief journey, but I think it's really helpful for people.
Yes, I put off grief because, Dave died, and then both of my parents were still alive, but they were failing, and of course they died as well. But I did notice within a month or so, I was getting really strange body pains. My jaw hurt. I had my tingling in my leg, and there was no obvious source of, physical where this was coming from. And I did go to a acupuncturist. And in fact, I went to her for over 2 years. She pressed on these spots on my upper arms and said, "Is that tender?" Yeah, it was very tender. It's still tender. Those are grief points.
Really?
Yes. And I think there are a lot of people walking around these days with grief, and they don't know what to do about it. But so going to the acupuncturist helped. I had insomnia. I have weight gain, 10 pounds, which I have yet to lose. And it just, the insomnia was the worst. But those are all signs of grief. And there's not anything that will make it better quickly. It's just, a process. But I think going to therapy, grief therapy, acupuncture, massages, whatever can help address the physical manifestations of grief is helpful. But also, talking about it, I went to a spouse loss grief support group for a year and a half. And that was good too, to know, I'm not the only person who's, one and only died, and now we have to deal with life. But I also found I've used films and film clips in my talks quite a lot. And I have a whole section in 98.6 Mortality Movies to See Before You Die about grief and growth. And believe it or not, the film Gravity is a powerful meditation on loss and returning to life. And so I'm a certified thanatologist. That's a fancy name for a death educator, although I am one of your more outside-the-box death educators. But there is, if you'd like, I can share with you Therese Rando's 6 hours about processing grief, the mourning processes. So number 1, recognize the loss. That's pretty important to start with because, some people aren't even going to recognize the loss. React to the pain of the separation. Recollect, identify, and mourn the primary and secondary losses. So when you say the primary, it's like, okay, my loved one just died. That's the primary loss. That person is gone. A secondary loss would be, the income they brought into the family is gone. Our status in the community, my status as a person is changed now. That's another secondary loss. 4th are relinquish old attachments to the deceased and the old assumptive world. And my example of that, so it's been 2.5, it'll be 3 years in April since Dave died. I am just now redecorating the room that used to be his office, clearing everything out. I'm going to have the whole room painted, the floor refinished, everything. And I'm making it my personal spa room. I got a sauna I'm going to put in there. So that's like 2.5 years later. It takes a while sometimes to do that processing. The last 2 are readjust to move into a new world without forgetting the old, and reinvest in new relationships. And I finally feel like I've gotten to the point where I can be at those last 2.
You have a quote on your website, and you also say this in some of your talks. Just as talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead, and your family will benefit from the conversation. With all of the years you've spent in this field and the research you've done and the interactions you've had with people, why do you think there's such a deep cultural hesitancy around discussing death in the United States specifically, which I think we're probably one of the worst at this? And do you feel like your work is having an impact sort of pushing against that taboo?
Yes, I feel like I am having an impact, and I love it when people tell me, you helped me to have this conversation with my parents or with my spouse or with whoever. People don't want to talk about it for a number of reasons. I don't want to be morbid. Or they think if I talk about it, it's going to happen sooner rather than later. No, it's going to happen whether you talk about it or not. And it's better to talk about it and at least have an idea and be prepared. In fact, I had another death in my family just a couple of weeks ago. My youngest brother keeled over with heart failure, and he was dead fast. And his husband was, trying to keep him going with chest compressions, but the EMTs got there. He called me and he said, I think he's gone. So it can happen that fast. And people don't like the idea of the Grim Reaper hovering around in the background, ready to strike at any moment. So, but I'm living proof. So far, so good. I keep talking about it, and I'm still here.
Exactly. Do you think that it is our independence, that we were fostered on independence in this country? I had a conversation with Todd Hera, who's a 5th-generation funeral director.
I know Todd, yes.
Okay. And I'm reading his book right now, Last Rites, which is so fascinating. It goes through all of the history, not just in our country, but in the world. But, there was a time in our country when we were much physically closer to death. And I think we have lost something in losing that connectivity to the physicality of death. So I'm not sure we were always this way in this country, but we have seemed to go in this direction where it's like denial, denial, denial. And then it happens. And if we don't know what our loved ones wanted, or if we haven't told them what we wanted and they can't honor that, I think it makes the grief process much more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many people, including, other than Orthodox Jews, are choosing cremation. And just to bring it back to some of the Jewish traditions, that Shiva period of mourning starts after burial. Well, if you're getting cremated and not burying, when do you start officially mourning this person? It's something I'm facing with my brother Glenn. But if you have written a will and what you want done with your cremated remains, or if you want to be buried, if you bought burial plots, and sometimes people think, oh, I'm good, I got a burial plot. Well, there's funeral planning that also has to take place before you can be buried in that plot. So it's a multi-step process to get ready for end-of-life issues. My brother-in-law, Stephen, had put in his will that he wanted to be cremated. And because he was an artist who had done a series of artwork about Route 66, he said he wanted some of his remains scattered in the cemetery where his parents and his brother are, and then also be scattered along Route 66. So that gave me a mission to do this. And I've been doing this. I did it in Arizona. I piece in Chicago where Route 66 starts, and Santa Monica where it ends. So in my own way, this ash scattering mission is my moving memorial service to my brother-in-law. And I am so glad he said, this is what I want done, because it gives your loved ones guidance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about some of your books and maybe where you would suggest a listener start.
Okay, well, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die is a great overarching look at the party no one wants to plan. And it does have a chapter about funeral traditions in different religious sects or religions in general. Hail and Farewell, Cremation Ceremonies, Templates and Tips is great for any kind of memorial service. It actually does have templates for different kind of services and readings and music suggestions, things like that. Kicking the Bucket List, 100 Downsizing and Organizing Things to Do Before You Die is a great book for 2/3 of it is about downsizing, ways you can approach it, great ways to get rid of stuff. And then the last third is planning end-of-life issue elements. And it has an executor checklist in the back. And then my latest all about the movies, 98.6 Mortality Movies to See Before You Die, which has discussion guides for each of these movies. And it's actually more like 142 movies and TV shows.
Wow.
And
okay.
yes, you can find all them at my website, agoodgoodbye.com. I do offer a 10-page planning form that you can download for free. And you can also get some of my fun T-shirts with sayings like, the one who dies with the most toys still dies.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Before I Die Festival and why you started it? And I know you're not going to do it this year, but what it's all about?
So Before I Die Festival is an opportunity for people to come together and hear speakers. This year we had a resource fair, and that was hugely successful, all about death doulas and green burial and estate planning attorneys. And we had a band where they would play music and we'd celebrate life. So it could be a one-day or a multi-day festival where people could go behind the scenes at a funeral home and learn all about what goes on there. Just an honest, open approach to learning about end-of-life issues without the idea that we have to be scared about this. And it's been very successful.
So it's
and
like
I want more people to do them.
It's like a Death Café on steroids.
Yes.
In a way. Okay. Okay, amazing. What have you learned about supporting people, not just through death, but through grief also? And I'm wondering that might be your next book on grief.
In fact, yeah, I am thinking about doing a memoir about all of these deaths and what we can learn from my experience. So I'm not a grief counselor.
Yeah.
But I have experienced it in spades for sure. And I think what I would advise people is to connect with others. Don't try to deal with grief by yourself. Just connecting with others who have also had a loss, like a grief support group, is a great thing. Going to a grief counselor, but don't feel like you have to carry grief by yourself. Chances are, if it's the death of a parent and you have siblings, I know sometimes sibling relationships can be difficult, but maybe that's a way one could reconnect with someone you grew up with. Also seek out other resources. There are a lot of grief resources out there, especially if somebody dies on hospice. They do offer grief support groups that you can attend for as long as you want, basically. In fact, I don't think you even have to be a client of a hospice to go to their grief support group.
And going back to the psychedelic-assisted therapy, I had a therapist on in another series, and she does ketamine treatment, but she talked a lot, and I think it's worth going back to what she said. Like, it's very important that you choose to do that with a group that's very well regarded and safe. Like, safety is key, both physical safety, but also I would say emotional safety. And I know sometimes people do those in big groups, but that can be challenging too. And she talked about the challenges that you can face with that. So I think it's a great option, and people just need to be very intentional in choosing how and where and when to do it. And she said that too, like integration and, ongoing work. Absolutely. Is there anything that I have not asked you about the Hevra Kadisha, about your work as a death educator, as an author, as a speaker, that you want to share with listeners before we get to 5 questions that I like to ask everybody at the end of every episode?
Well, I would like to mention the importance of the 7 days of Shiva after someone dies, after the funeral. At the funeral, the attention shifts from preparing the body and getting the funeral arrangements done to supporting the mourners, the immediate family, the closest loved ones of that person. After Dave died, I stayed in my house for that entire week, and people came and visited me and brought me food. It is an opportunity to get the support of your community, an opportunity to talk about that loved one who died. And then after the 7 days are over, there's a tradition of leaving the house with a group of friends and walking around the block to demonstrate to the community that those first 7 intense days of mourning are over. A friend of mine took a picture of me with a couple of girlfriends in the park. We were walking into the sun, and my shadow was behind me, and there was a blue orb in my shadow. And I had taken a picture of Dave's photo with the 7-day candle, which is in a blue glass holder. It was the same color blue. So I felt like, oh, his spirit is following me. And that was very interesting. And it is important to have a home to be in to do this intense mourning, because when my dad died, he was to be buried in the Washington, D.C. area, and we had sold the family home. So my brothers and I rented some hotel rooms and went and visited other family in the area. And I had very disturbed dreams after that. So when my mom died a year later, I rented an Airbnb house right around the corner from where we used to live, and people came and visited us and brought us food. And it was a much better experience for me anyway. My niece, she was like, we're out here in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do. And I was like, that's kind of the point, honey.
Well, I think that's really good practical advice because whatever your tradition, you don't always geographically, you're not always living where the funeral is going to be. And so thinking about how you're going to take care of yourself during that time after the funeral. And I mean, in Judaism is so interesting too. So it's a full year before you unveil the grave site, the headstone. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Sure. Well, then, after that 7 days, there's 30 days of shlosh, which is you're more getting out back to society, but you're not going to, movies or dancing or, and you could also be going to the synagogue to say the mourner's Kaddish with other people. And then at 11 months or a full year, one would have the marker set and do an unveiling. And part of that tradition is to give yourself a full year of going through the seasons, going through the holidays without that person, and coming to the cemetery at that time and place to recognize, okay, we've made it a year and we can see if we can return fully to life now that we've gone that year.
Well, this has been such a good discussion. I'm really grateful. So I have 5 questions I like to ask at the end of every episode. The first one is, as we explore in my brand, âme attendre, which is French for to take care of your soul, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us and tie us to the past, enable us to be more in the here and now, or sometimes even take us into the future. Can you share an object from your life, whether you still have it or not, that holds a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
I have a housemate, and that's what she does, is show and tales, which is, show an object which has meaning for you. This is a Hanukkah menorah.
Yeah.
And it looks like the skyline of Jerusalem. On the bottom, it says, gather with family and friends as you celebrate the Festival of Lights. This is meaningful to me because when Dave and I got married, we got married on the 7th night of Hanukkah. And I bought this menorah specifically for the wedding. So every Hanukkah, I bring it out and light it up and gather with family and friends because they are the people who will support you through your greatest losses.
Yeah, thank you. Can you also share a favorite tradition? It could be something from when you were a child or something that you did with Dave or really anything at all.
Oh, so, we're Jewish, but we both grew up with mothers that gave us stockings to hang either on the fireplace or on our closet doors at Christmas time. So we still have stockings. I still have the stockings. But at some point we decided, you know what, let's just not do the gift exchange thing. But somehow we'd wake up on Christmas and there would still be stuff there. And Dave and I would joke, we forgot to put the blood on the doorpost. So Santa visited.
So funny. My little sister has 3 girls, and her eldest, who's now in high school, they were up in Lake Tahoe one time during Hanukkah. And she was young, and she was worried that Santa was going to not know that they were Jewish and bring them gifts. So she wrote this letter. Santa, thank you for coming, but we are gooish. She spelled it Gooish. And it was so wonderful. 1, that she believed in Santa, and then 2, the whole note. So you're not alone in that. And I joke that I married a Catholic so that I could celebrate Christmas because I love Christmas. Are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
Oh, I've always enjoyed entertaining in my home. even under the shadow of death, I still managed to have a few entertaining things. And now I'm doing a regular mortality movie night in my living room where I have people come and watch movies, and I have a big screen. I project them on, and I love it. And then we have a conversation afterwards. Popcorn and chocolate.
Okay, two of my favorites. And would you say, it sounds like from the way you're describing it, that the thing that you love about entertaining is the human connection?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always love bringing different people together and seeing what kind of conversations come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not about what you're serving, although popcorn and chocolate sounds delicious.
Yeah.
It's really about the connection, and in your case, tying it to, your passion in life, in death education. So you've talked about your books. You can tell us about them again, but do you have one or two other top resources? And they don't have to be about death. It could just be, or grief. It could just be like a couple of your favorites. A lot of our listeners like to read a lot, so we just love to get people's favorite books or podcasts or anything else.
Well, let's see. I do have a game that I created for the Frozen Dead Guy Days Festival in Nederland, Colorado, which now it's in Estes Park. But yeah, it's like the newlywed game, but the questions are how well you know your partner's last wishes.
Okay, what is that called?
The Newly Dead game.
Okay, okay, got it.
I like Caitlin Doty's books. She is a very funny writer, and she is a mortician. She's doing more YouTube videos now, but she has a few books out. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs?
Okay.
And From Here to Eternity.
Okay, never heard of her, so that's a new one. Last question, what do you do for yourself? I mean, you've talked some about your healing journey, but do you have a practice, a focus, a habit, or daily routine that contributes to your success and or your well-being?
I love to soak in my hot tub. I don't do it every night, but usually I get some of my best ideas when I'm in the shower or in the hot tub.
And you have soon to have a sauna, which I think you're going to also add to your routine.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I've learned so much. I know others are going to learn so much, and we will watch for the new book.
Thank you, Ashley. I've enjoyed it myself, too. Thank you.
On the Table with Ashley is presented by Amatond, an elevated, everyday, luxury home and tableware brand with products designed to cultivate connection. You can learn more about Amatond at ametendre.com or on Instagram at Amatond. By subscribing to our newsletter on the Amatond website, you'll receive updates on new episodes as well as promotions relating to Amatond and Amatond's products. Send us an email at reachoutanytime@amatond.com if you have ideas for guests or series ideas you'd like to pass along. Thanks for listening.